Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Late one night, Alexander sat at his desk, wrapped in the quiet hum of his home office. The faint light from his monitor flickered as he scrolled through his calendar, his mind still tangled in the endless web of work commitments. Just as he was about to shut down for the night, an unusual entry caught his eye: weekend retreat. He squinted at the details, trying to make sense of it. The retreat was set for the upcoming weekend, a time he distinctly remembered mentioning to Vanessa as being out of town for business. His pulse quickened. There was no trace of a company or organization, just a simple telling note for two. The ambiguity gnawed at him, stirring something dark and unwelcome in the pit of his stomach. Vanessa hadn't mentioned anything, and lately her distance seemed deliberate, laced with vague excuses and sudden, unexplained disappearances. For the first time, a bitter seed of doubt took root. Without a word, Alexander decided he would adjust his travel plans, slipping away on a business trip of his own. But this time, the agenda would be different. This time, he would follow her, letting the shadows reveal what she hid so carefully. The week passed with an eerie calm. Vanessa went about her days as usual, quiet, composed, and seemingly unaware of Alexander's suspicions. Each of her gestures, every half-hearted smile she cast his way, began to feel like a performance, a play designed to keep him at ease while she drifted further from him. The bitterness grew in him, dark and simmering. On Friday evening, as she packed a small leather suitcase, Alexander watched from the hallway, carefully hidden from view. He noted each item she tucked into the bag: a silk blouse he'd never seen, her favorite perfume, and a familiar red dress she used to wear on their special evenings. She handled the items delicately, as though savoring a secret that she alone held. He felt his chest tighten. Memories of past weekends together, of laughter and warmth, rushed in unwanted. But Alexander tamped down the ache and reminded himself why he was doing this. The calendar entry lingered in his mind: a weekend for two. If she had been planning this with him in mind, she would have mentioned it, wouldn't she? But no, Vanessa had kept it to herself, as she'd kept so much from him lately. Once she left, Alexander prepared swiftly. He knew her destination from a quick glance at the hotel's booking confirmation on her phone, and it was a secluded mountain resort, a place they'd once spoken of visiting together. The irony bit at him. He packed a bag with bare essentials and tucked his own work travel itinerary into his coat pocket, a plausible alibi in case he needed one. Before heading out, he texted her a quick, impersonal message, just enough to suggest he was busy, unavailable for the weekend. The drive up the mountain was long and cold, each curve in the road tightening the coil of tension within him. With every mile, the doubt and anger twisted deeper, accompanied by a haunting question: who would he find there with her? Vanessa had left so many parts of herself hidden, and he wondered just how many of those hidden parts belonged to someone else entirely. By the time he reached the hotel, darkness had settled over the mountains, casting shadows across the quiet resort. It was a rustic place, built from dark timber, blending naturally into the dense forest around it. Alexander parked far enough away to avoid suspicion, opting to keep himself as invisible as possible. If she noticed him too soon, he'd lose any chance of uncovering the truth. In the lobby, he glimpsed her from behind as she checked in, her hair loose, her posture relaxed. There was a brief moment of hope when he saw she was alone, but it faded when she glanced at her phone with a soft smile before pocketing it quickly. Alexander didn't stay in sight for long. He booked a room under a different name, choosing a corner suite from which he could watch the entrance discreetly. His eyes flicked between the hotel lobby and the flickering fireplace in his room, his mind churning. Would she notice him here? Would her accomplice arrive soon? The waiting was agonizing, each minute passing like an eternity. But he was determined to see it through, even if the truth shattered everything he'd once believed. As the night deepened, the soft glow of the hotel lobby dimmed to a quiet hum, leaving Alexander alone with the thick silence of his room. He sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the entrance below, a slow-burning sense of dread filling the emptiness. Hours had passed since Vanessa checked in, and his mind was clouded with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Who was he waiting for? What would he do when they arrived? He didn't know, but he felt himself gripped by an unshakable resolve to see it through. Finally, movement at the entrance broke the monotony. A man had arrived. Alexander's pulse quickened as he watched the stranger approach the hotel's front desk, exchanging a few words with the receptionist before receiving his room key. He was younger than Alexander had expected, perhaps early 30s, with a casual air of confidence that only intensified Alexander's simmering anger. As the man turned to walk towards the elevators, Alexander caught sight of his face. He wore a subtle, knowing smile, as though he were privy to a secret that no one else could understand. Alexander clenched his fist. This had to be him. There was no mistaking that expression, the air of someone familiar with what lay beyond closed doors. Vanessa's companion. The man disappeared around the corner, but Alexander was already in motion. He slipped quietly out of his room, just in time to see the elevator doors slide shut. His heart pounding, he waited, watching the floor indicator as it climbed to the top level. Room 318. Taking a deep breath, Alexander entered the next elevator, his mind racing. He had no plan, only the raw, painful urge to confront whatever lay on the other side of that door. The elevator doors opened with a muted chime, and he stepped into the dimly lit corridor. He made his way down the hall, counting the numbers: 314, 316, 318. The corridor was empty. Silence pressed in on him as he approached the door, listening for any sign of life on the other side. He strained to hear, but there was nothing except his own shallow breathing and the pounding of his heart. He knew he had to act before he second-guessed himself. Steeling himself, he raised a hand and knocked. Seconds stretched painfully as he waited, half expecting Vanessa to open the door. But it wasn't her. The door swung open to reveal the man from the lobby, his face twisting in faint surprise as he took in Alexander's presence. There was a flicker of recognition, but the man quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice casual, as though he were merely greeting a guest. Alexander studied him, his jaw tightening. He spoke carefully, each word like a warning. "I believe you're here for my wife." The man's expression faltered, and Alexander saw a flash of unease cross his face. For a moment, they stood in tense silence, both sizing each other up. "I think you have the wrong room," the man replied, his tone still calm, but a slight edge had crept into his voice. Alexander's gaze was unyielding. "I don't think so. I've been watching you. I know exactly why you're here." The man's face hardened, his polite veneer slipping. "If you know what's good for you, I suggest you leave. This isn't the place or time for drama." The words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken threat. But Alexander didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "You're right. This isn't the time for drama. I just want the truth." They stood locked in a silent standoff, each man unwilling to back down. Alexander could feel his control slipping, his anger threatening to boil over. But he held himself back, forcing himself to wait. He wasn't here for a confrontation, not yet. He was here to understand how far Vanessa's deception ran, and for that, he needed more than just a moment's anger. After the confrontation at the door, Alexander retreated back to his room, mind racing. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling left by the man's dismissive smirk, his casual arrogance. The stranger hadn't denied knowing Vanessa, yet he seemed unfazed by Alexander's veiled threat. It wasn't merely an affair, there was something darker in that man's confidence, something hidden beneath his charm. Alexander couldn't sleep, each thought pulling him further into a maze of doubt and suspicion. He watched his phone's clock flicker through the early morning hours, his mind churning over every word exchanged, every glance shared. What was Vanessa truly hiding? He'd come here to uncover her secrets, but it seemed he'd only stumbled into something far more complex. Just after dawn, Alexander's patience snapped. He needed answers, and waiting any longer wasn't an option. He left his room and headed downstairs, finding a quiet spot near the lobby where he could watch the hallways. Not long after, Vanessa appeared, walking towards the dining area, her face serene and untroubled as she scanned the tables, looking for someone. Alexander stayed in the shadows, hidden from her view, watching as she found a small, secluded table by the window and took a seat. Minutes later, the stranger joined her. He slid into the chair across from Vanessa, and they exchanged a glance that held more than mere acquaintance. He said something that made her laugh softly, her hand brushing his briefly before she pulled it away, glancing around the room as if to check for prying eyes. Alexander felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of betrayal and fury swirling within him. He decided to follow them discreetly, hoping they'd reveal something that would make sense of this twisted situation. The two lingered over breakfast, exchanging quiet words and sidelong glances, before they stood up and exited the dining area together. Alexander kept a safe distance, trailing them down a hallway that led towards a series of conference rooms. They entered one of the rooms, closing the door behind them. Alexander waited outside, his heart pounding as he leaned close to the door, straining to catch any sound from within. A few muffled words slipped through, fragments of their conversation that only fueled his unease. He heard Vanessa's voice, low and tense, saying, "It's not as simple as you think." And the man's response, sharper than before, "We've been over this. If you don't make a decision, someone else will." The threat in the man's words sent a chill through Alexander. This wasn't just an affair, it was something bigger, more dangerous. The pieces started to fall into place, and he realized that Vanessa had become entangled in something far beyond infidelity. But what was she risking for this man? And why? Unable to bear the silence any longer, Alexander decided to take a gamble. He knocked softly on the door, then immediately slipped into a nearby alcove, watching as the door opened cautiously. The man looked out, his gaze searching the hallway, before closing the door and returning inside. The moment the man's back was turned, Alexander slipped back to the lobby, feeling a new, determined resolve solidify within him. If Vanessa was hiding more than an affair, he would find it. He would uncover the full extent of her deceit, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for her secrets to hide. His mind reeled with questions, each one more troubling than the last. Was Vanessa being threatened, manipulated, or was she a willing player in this dangerous game? Alexander felt his grip tighten on his phone as he pulled up her contacts, scrolling through the names until he found her recent messages. Each one was coded, vague, but enough to confirm she'd been planning this for some time. The truth was close, hovering just out of reach, and he felt it pull him forward, pushing him to uncover the answers, no matter what they cost. Alexander turned back towards the hallway, steeling himself. He would see this game through to the end, one way or another. Alexander returned to his room, the unease gnawing at him sharper than ever. Vanessa's words, "It's not as simple as you think," echoed in his mind, deepening the mystery. This wasn't the straightforward affair he had expected to uncover. Something far more intricate lay behind her deceptions. As he pieced together her guarded behavior, her coded messages, and the cryptic exchanges with her companion, Alexander began to suspect that his wife was entangled in something darker than mere infidelity. He knew he needed to see more of what was going on behind the closed doors of room 318. With a resolve born of anger and determination, he left his room and made his way quietly through the hotel's dim hallways. He passed only a few guests, none of whom seemed to take notice of his tense stride or the dark focus in his eyes. At the end of the hallway, Alexander waited outside room 318, his ear pressed against the door. Muffled voices filtered through, barely audible but enough to sense the urgency in their tone. Vanessa's voice was strained, the softness he knew replaced by something harsher, colder. The man's response was curt, clipped, as though every word held a hidden agenda. Alexander heard her say, "This is dangerous, you said no one would get hurt." Her companion responded with a slight chuckle, his tone sharp. "That was before you complicated things, Vanessa." The words sent a chill down Alexander's spine. Was his wife in over her head? Was she a pawn in a scheme far beyond her control? The need for answers pushed him to action. He moved quickly, slipping down the hallway and into the stairwell, where he could compose himself without the risk of being seen. He had come to this hotel for clarity, for the simple answer to a wife's betrayal. But now, it seemed Vanessa was concealing something with far graver implications. Back in his room, he reviewed her recent messages, each one more cryptic than the last. His heart pounded as he opened a new message thread, this time between her and a contact labeled E. There, he found an exchange he hadn't noticed before, likely buried beneath her careful efforts to keep her secrets hidden. "E, you'll bring it, right? Don't make this difficult." "Vanessa, I'm not sure about this. You promised no one would get hurt." "E, only if you hold up your end, Vanessa. It's simple." The exchange only deepened the knot of dread within him. E. Eric. The name seemed innocuous enough, but now it was marked with darkness, a threat that ran beyond his comprehension. The anger that had driven him here began to give way to something else, a chilling realization that Vanessa might be in far more danger than he'd imagined. He sat down heavily, contemplating his next move. He could confront her, force her to reveal what was really going on. But if her actions truly went beyond an affair, if they involved something criminal or dangerous, then any confrontation could put her at risk. It was a thought he hadn't expected, a pang of worry, a twinge of the love that once anchored their lives together. Alexander felt torn between rage and an urge to protect her. He knew he needed more than suspicion before he could act. And so, he decided to gather what evidence he could. The hotel's surveillance cameras, if accessible, could confirm whether Vanessa had met this Eric at other times, or if other guests might be involved in this shadowy plot. As night began to fall once more, Alexander took a breath and left his room, his resolve firm. He'd be cautious, watching every move Vanessa made, tracking every interaction, every hidden glance. Whatever secrets Vanessa thought she could bury here, he was going to uncover them. And then, if it came to it, he would finally confront her, forcing her, once and for all, to tell him the truth. The hotel lobby was quiet in the early evening, bathed in the golden glow of dimmed lamps, while Alexander moved silently through the space. He had a singular goal now: find the hotel's security room. If he could access the surveillance footage, he might finally see the interactions between Vanessa and Eric for himself. Alexander didn't know exactly what he'd find, but he knew it would be enough to confirm his suspicions or shatter them completely. After a few inquiries with the hotel staff, he located the security office near the service corridors, secluded from the public eye. A hasty excuse about lost property got him in the door, where a bored security guard greeted him with mild disinterest. Alexander managed a calm demeanor, asking the guard if they could look over some footage together. He told the guard he thought his missing item might have been misplaced in the lobby yesterday, and, with enough emphasis on the urgency of his loss, the guard relented. With his heart racing, Alexander positioned himself over the guard's shoulder, watching the screens as yesterday's footage began to play. He gritted his teeth as he saw Vanessa enter the lobby, her suitcase rolling behind her, and head to the front desk. The footage confirmed her expression, composed, no trace of the anxiousness she'd been hiding from him lately. But then came the moment he dreaded. Eric appeared in the background, his eyes sharp and watchful as he moved toward her. They exchanged a few brief words, and she looked up at him with a subtle but unmistakable familiarity. The scene made Alexander's blood run cold. Eric wasn't just an acquaintance or a casual fling. The way Vanessa's hand brushed against his arm, her guarded smile, everything spoke of a relationship long established and carefully hidden. They stayed close for a moment before Eric touched her back, guiding her toward the elevators. "Wait here," Alexander told the guard, who barely looked up as Alexander hurriedly left the room, his mind churning with fury and disbelief. He needed air, needed to clear his thoughts from the images that played in his mind like a cruel reel. But before he could leave the lobby, Alexander caught sight of Vanessa herself. She was alone, standing by the large bay windows, her expression a mix of contemplation and tension. He could tell she was waiting for something or someone. Maybe Eric was due to meet her here soon. The idea sent a bitter twist of jealousy through him, but he suppressed it, knowing he needed a different tactic now. He approached her slowly, keeping his steps quiet on the carpeted floor. "Vanessa," he said softly. She jumped, turning around, her face a mask of shock that quickly slipped into an unconvincing smile. "Oh, Alexander, I thought you were out of town," her voice trailed off, the pretense in her words painfully obvious. "Change my plans," he replied, his gaze steady. He could feel her nervous energy, the slightest tremor in her hands, as she struggled to keep her expression neutral. I just needed some time for myself," she stammered, casting a quick glance at the front desk, as if hoping Eric might appear to save her from this unexpected encounter. "It's just a weekend getaway. That's all." "A weekend getaway," Alexander echoed, his voice low, edged with the anger he could no longer keep entirely hidden. "Are you sure that's all, Vanessa?" He saw the flash of guilt in her eyes, something unspoken lurking behind her forced calm. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Finally, she simply turned away, looking out the window as if hoping the mountains would offer an answer she couldn't bring herself to give. Alexander stepped closer, his voice a whisper that only she could hear. "Does Eric know you're hiding?" Her face paled, the last of her pretense shattering. You don't understand," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he demanded, a cold calm overtaking him. "Explain it. Or am I just supposed to keep pretending?" Her silence was answer enough. He knew then that her secrets ran deeper than he'd ever imagined, and he could feel the gulf between them widen, an unbridgeable divide built from years of deception. With every word left unsaid, his resolve solidified. He would uncover the truth, every last hidden piece she tried to keep from him. After their tense encounter, Alexander's mind was sharper than ever, his suspicions finally gaining shape. Vanessa's shock and silence confirmed what he feared. Her deception was no accident, no fleeting mistake. There was more here, something far darker she was tangled in, and Eric was at its center. His jaw set with cold determination, Alexander left Vanessa by the window and made his way down the corridor, knowing exactly where to find her mysterious companion. He approached room 318, the scene of his earlier confrontation with Eric. This time, he wasn't interested in half answers or polite games. The truth had gone hidden long enough. With a swift knock, he waited, listening for any movement behind the door. After a tense moment, he heard footsteps. The door opened and Eric stood there, his expression turning from surprise to something darker, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Alexander. "What is it now?" Eric asked, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. Alexander stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, closing the door firmly behind him. "I'm not here to play games," he said, his voice steely. You're going to tell me exactly what's going on between you and my wife. Eric smirked, leaning back against the dresser, his casual demeanor barely masking a flicker of annoyance. I think you're in over your head, Alexander. Vanessa has her reasons. Reasons you clearly aren't meant to understand. Then explain them to me, Alexander demanded. I've already seen enough to know you're not just some casual fling. For the first time, Eric's mask slipped, and Alexander caught a glimpse of something darker in the man's gaze. Fine. You want the truth. Vanessa came to me because she was tired of living a lie with you. His voice held a cold disdain. She wanted out of the dull life you trapped her in. I offered her an escape. Alexander's fists clenched, but he kept his anger in check. And just what kind of escape do you think you're offering her? Eric chuckled, the sound low and bitter, one that involves a life she chooses for herself, not one where she's some trophy wife shackled by loyalty to a man who never even sees her for who she really is. The words hit their mark, each one a barb tearing into the foundation of everything Alexander believed about his marriage. But he noticed something else too, something Eric wasn't saying. So you're here to free her, is that it? Alexander asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Or is there something else you're keeping hidden? A flash of anger crossed Eric's face. You really don't get it, do you? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Vanessa's already chosen Alexander. She's chosen me. So why don't you take your broken ego and leave us alone? The challenge was blatant, but Alexander held his ground, his mind racing. It wasn't just an affair. Eric's words revealed something more possessive, even dangerous. This wasn't a relationship built on love or connection. It was something far more controlling. And as he looked at Eric, he realized the man's smug facade concealed an obsession, a desire not just for Vanessa, but for the thrill of stealing her away. You think you know her? Alexander said, his tone cold. But all you see is someone to conquer. Vanessa's not a prize for you to parade around. Eric's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. And who are you to lecture me about her, Alexander? You're the one she's been running from all this time. The words hung between them, and Alexander knew he could no longer hold back. If you're so certain she's ready to leave, then let's find out. I want to hear it from her. Eric scoffed, but Alexander noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Fine, he said. Let's get this over with. He moved past Alexander, heading toward the door with a slight stumble, perhaps caught off guard by how quickly his plan was unraveling. They returned to the lobby, where Vanessa still stood by the window, her expression clouded with worry as she saw the two men approach. Alexander watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted between him and Eric, searching, calculating. Eric broke the silence first. Tell him, Vanessa. Tell him what you told me. That you're done with this life. But Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Alexander, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw regret in her gaze. Her voice was barely a whisper. I needed something different, Alexander. Her answer, teetering between two worlds, only solidified his resolve. He turned back to Eric, his gaze unyielding. Then we're going to get everything out in the open right here, right now. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by Vanessa's shaky breaths and the sharp glances exchanged between the two men. The calm, empty lobby seemed to amplify every unsaid word, every unresolved tension. Alexander's gaze never left Vanessa's face, searching for any sign of the truth. But Vanessa, caught between her husband and her lover, seemed unable to choose which mask to wear. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her purse, her eyes darting between them, her mind clearly struggling with a decision she hadn't expected to face so suddenly. Eric stepped forward, his voice dripping with impatience. Go on, Vanessa. Tell him. Tell him you're done playing the perfect wife and that you're moving on with me. Vanessa looked at him, but the conviction she'd once shown seemed to have faded in the harsh light of confrontation. She swallowed, her voice faltering as she said, It was never supposed to be like this. Eric, I needed a break. Yes, but I didn't plan for things to go this far. The admission hung in the air, fragile and raw. Alexander felt a cold weight lift, only to be replaced by the hollow understanding of what had really been happening. She hadn't planned to leave him, not fully, at least. It had all been a game to her, a dangerous flirtation with the life she thought she wanted, fueled by Eric's manipulation. She'd been drawn to Eric's world, enticed by the illusion of freedom, but now that she was being forced to choose, her resolve was crumbling. Eric's face darkened, his patience slipping away. He grabbed her arm, his grip possessive, almost forceful. You're wasting time, Vanessa. You already made your decision. You came here with me. Now, either we leave together or you go back to playing house with him. The desperation in Eric's voice gave him away, his mask slipping entirely. Alexander could see now how his charm had worn thin, revealing a darker truth beneath. Eric wasn't Vanessa's escape. He was her trap. "That's enough, Eric," Alexander said, stepping closer. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "You think you can force her to leave her life behind, that you've got her under some spell. But maybe you didn't realize she's been keeping secrets from you too." Eric's sneer faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You think you know her? She's been done with you for a long time, Alexander." She was just waiting for the courage to say it. But Vanessa's silence spoke volumes. She finally looked up at Alexander, and he saw the truth in her eyes, the fear, the regret, the dawning realization of her own mistakes. She'd fallen into something she couldn't control, played with emotions in people's lives without understanding the consequences. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough. "Alexander, I never meant to hurt you like this. I thought I was missing something, but I didn't know it would come to this." Eric's grip tightened, his expression twisted with anger. "You're not backing out now, Vanessa. After everything we planned, everything I gave up for you." But she pulled her arm free, her voice firmer now. "It was a mistake, Eric. I can see that now." Her tone shifted, and Alexander saw a glimmer of the Vanessa he once knew, the woman who could face her own choices, even the wrong ones. "I don't need you to save me from my life. I never did." A fury lit in Eric's eyes, but Alexander quickly stepped between them, his stance resolute. "You heard her. It's over." For a tense moment, Eric looked like he might lash out, his face taut with fury and betrayal. But then he took a step back, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Fine. You two deserve each other." He looked at Vanessa one last time, disgust flashing across his face. "Good luck with that." With that, Eric turned and strode out of the hotel, leaving them in a silence that was both damning and liberating. Vanessa watched him go, her face a mask of shock mingled with relief. Finally, she turned to Alexander, her shoulders slumping under the weight of what she'd almost lost. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice broken. "I don't know how we ended up here. I thought I was searching for something real, but maybe it was already here." Alexander took a deep breath, the hurt and anger still raw, but he forced himself to look at her, not as the stranger she'd become, but as the woman he had once loved deeply. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew they'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be undone. "We'll talk," he said quietly, his tone steady but guarded. "But not here, not now." And as they turned and walked out together, Alexander felt the first hint of closure. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with wounds that would take time to heal, if they ever did. But for now, at least, the truth lay between them, clear and undeniable.